A sudden blizzard struck on Christmas night. At a small, rundown diner, Keisha was struggling with no electricity, a broken heater, and her 2-year-old son shivering from the cold. Suddenly, there was a noise outside. 25 Hell's Angels appeared, lined up at her diner's door. They begged her for shelter to escape the snowstorm. Though terrified, her kind heart led her to invite them inside. Together they cooked and chatted happily with each other. She had no idea that just 3 days later, her act of kindness would summon 1,500 roaring motorcycles to her doorstep, changing not only her life, but an entire community forever. Before we go back, let us know where you're watching from, and subscribe, because tomorrow I've got something extra special for you. The clock on the cracked kitchen wall read 3:47 in the morning when Keisha Williams finally allowed herself to sit down. Her calloused hands trembled as she counted the crumpled bills scattered across the wooden table. $7.32. That was all that stood between her 2-year-old son Marcus and an empty belly come morning. Keisha pressed her palms against her tired eyes, feeling the weight of exhaustion seep into her bones. At 32 years old, she looked at least 40. Her dark skin had lost its youthful glow, replaced by the dull sheen of someone who worked 3 jobs just to survive. The small house around her creaked in the winter wind, a constant reminder of how alone she truly was. Marcus slept peacefully in the corner of the kitchen, curled up in a makeshift bed she had fashioned from old blankets and couch cushions. The heater in his bedroom had broken 2 weeks ago, and she couldn't afford to fix it. So she kept him close where the warmth from the stove could reach him. His tiny chest rose and fell with each breath, completely unaware that his mother was drowning in a sea of unpaid bills and broken dreams. The house sat isolated at the end of Maple Street in Detroit, separated from the other homes by an empty lot that nobody wanted to develop. It was as if the neighborhood had deliberately pushed her to the margins, just like everything else in her life. The white families who lived in the nicer houses down the street rarely acknowledged her existence. When they did, it was usually with suspicious glances or whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when she walked by. "Why did you have to leave us, Jerome?" she whispered to the empty room, her voice barely audible above the humming of the old refrigerator. Her ex-husband had walked out 8 months ago, claiming he needed to find himself. He had found himself all right living with a 23-year-old waitress in Tennessee, completely ignoring the child support payments that were supposed to help keep his son fed and housed. The divorce papers sat in a folder on top of the refrigerator stamped with red ink that might as well have been blood for all the pain they represented. Keisha's phone buzzed against the table, making her jump. A text message from her manager at the cleaning company glowed on the screen. "Don't bother coming in tomorrow. We're letting you go. Your kid was crying too much during your shift yesterday. Customers complained." The words hit her like a physical blow. She stared at the message, reading it over and over again, hoping the letters would somehow rearrange themselves into something less devastating. That was the 3rd job she had lost in 2 months. The laundromat had fired her when Marcus got sick, and she had to bring him to work. The diner let her go when she fell asleep during her shift after working 18 hours straight between all 3 jobs. "How am I supposed to work if I can't find anyone to watch you, baby?" she said, looking at her sleeping son. Daycare was $200 a week she didn't have. Family help was non-existent since her mother had passed away 3 years earlier, taking with her the last person who truly understood Keisha's struggles. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory, stern but loving. "Keisha, honey, remember what I taught you about my grandmother's fried chicken recipe? That secret blend of spices has been in our family for generations. One day, when times get tough, that recipe might just save you." At the time, Keisha had smiled and nodded, never imagining she would need salvation from a handful of herbs and spices. But now, sitting in her cold kitchen with her last $7, her mother's words felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. She walked to the old wooden cabinet where she kept her mother's recipe box. The index cards inside were yellowed with age, covered in her mother's careful handwriting. The fried chicken recipe was there, along with detailed instructions for sides and sauces that made her mouth water just reading them. Her mother had run a small soul food restaurant when Keisha was young, before the neighborhood changed and the customers stopped coming. "Maybe it's time to try again," she said to herself, though doubt immediately crept into her voice. The next morning, Keisha used her last $7 to buy chicken and basic ingredients. She set up 2 folding tables in her living room, creating a makeshift dining area next to her tiny kitchen. She made a handwritten menu on poster board and propped it against the front window. Mama's Kitchen, it read in careful letters, authentic soul food made with love. Marcus sat in his high chair, babbling happily as the smell of perfectly seasoned fried chicken filled the house. The secret was in the blend of spices her mother had taught her, a combination that made the coating crispy and flavorful in a way that made people close their eyes and sigh with satisfaction. But as the hours passed, reality set in. She watched through her window as people walked by on their way to the bus stop. Some slowed down when they saw the menu in her window, but when they saw her dark face through the glass, they quickened their pace and looked away. Mrs. Henderson from 3 houses down actually stopped and read the menu completely. Keisha felt her heart jump with hope and rushed to open the door. "Good morning, Mrs. Henderson. Would you like to try some of my fried chicken? It's made from my grandmother's recipe." Mrs. Henderson's expression changed the moment she saw Keisha's face. The older white woman's eyes narrowed with suspicion and something that looked uncomfortably like disgust. "I don't think so," she said, backing away from the door. "I heard about you. Single mother, no husband around. Probably don't even know who the father is. I don't eat food from people like that." The words cut deep, but Keisha forced herself to keep smiling. "The food is really good, ma'am. I promise it's clean and fresh." "I said no," Mrs. Henderson snapped, "and you shouldn't be running a business out of your house. This is a decent neighborhood. Keep your kind of trouble to yourself." Keisha watched her neighbor storm away, her chest tight with humiliation and anger. She closed the door and leaned against it, feeling the weight of rejection settle over her like a heavy blanket. Marcus looked up at her from his high chair, his innocent eyes wide and trusting. "It's okay, baby," she whispered, picking him up and holding him close. "Mama's going to figure this out. I promise." But as she looked around her empty restaurant, smelling the delicious food that no one wanted to buy, Keisha wondered if some promises were too big for one person to keep. Outside, the Detroit winter pressed against her windows, and inside, the isolation felt just as cold. The phone rang again. Another bill collector, no doubt. She let it go to voicemail, knowing she had nothing to tell them that they wanted to hear. Tomorrow, she would have to find another job, assuming anyone would hire a single black mother with a history of bringing her child to work. Marcus reached up and touched her face with his small hand, as if he could sense her sadness. "Mama," he said, one of the few words he knew clearly. "I'm here, baby," she replied, her voice thick with tears she refused to let fall. "Mama's right here." As the afternoon light faded through her windows, Keisha Williams held her son close and wondered how much longer she could keep fighting a world that seemed determined to keep her down. The smell of her mother's fried chicken recipe still lingered in the air, a reminder of dreams that felt increasingly out of reach. 3 weeks had passed since Mrs. Henderson's cruel words, and Keisha's small restaurant venture had attracted exactly 4 customers. 4 brave souls who had tasted her mother's fried chicken recipe and declared it the best they had ever eaten. But 4 customers couldn't pay the rent or keep the lights on, and the stack of unpaid bills on her kitchen table had grown taller each day. December 23rd arrived with an ominous gray sky that promised trouble. The weather reports had been warning about it for days, the worst snowstorm to hit Detroit in 20 years. Keisha stood at her kitchen window, watching the first flakes begin to fall as she stirred a pot of chicken and dumplings. At least she had managed to stock up on supplies before the storm hit. The few customers she had served had given her just enough money to buy ingredients in bulk, thinking optimistically about the Christmas rush that never came. "Mama cold," Marcus said from his high chair, rubbing his small hands together. Keisha turned up the heat on the stove and wrapped her son in an extra blanket. The house felt colder than usual, but she assumed it was just the storm approaching. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows with increasing intensity. By evening, the snow was falling in thick sheets that obscured everything beyond her front yard. The weather had become so severe that even the few cars that normally passed by her isolated house had disappeared completely. The silence was eerie, broken only by the howling wind and the occasional creak of tree branches bending under the weight of accumulating snow. Keisha fed Marcus his dinner and got him ready for bed, trying to ignore the growing cold that seemed to seep through the walls. She had turned the thermostat up twice, but the house didn't feel any warmer. A nagging worry began to form in the back of her mind. On Christmas Eve morning, she woke to a house that felt like a freezer. Her breath formed visible clouds in the air, and Marcus was shivering uncontrollably, despite being bundled in every blanket she owned. She rushed to the thermostat and found it displaying an error message she had never seen before. "No, no, no," she whispered, pressing buttons frantically. "Not now. Please, not now." She tried calling the heating repair service, but the automated message informed her that due to the severe weather conditions, all non-emergency calls would be handled after the storm passed. Emergency calls had a 72-hour wait time. 72 hours, she said aloud, staring at her phone in disbelief. Marcus began to cry, a thin, wailing sound that made her heart clench with panic. She picked him up and held him close, feeling how cold his little body had become despite the layers of clothing. The power went out that afternoon with a sudden click that plunged the house into darkness. Keisha fumbled for candles and matches, her hands shaking from both cold and fear. The few flickering flames provided minimal light and even less warmth. Outside, the storm raged with a fury that seemed almost supernatural, as if nature itself was determined to test her resolve. She moved Marcus into the kitchen, the smallest room in the house, hoping to conserve what little heat the candles could provide. Fortunately, her gas stove still worked, so she kept pots of water boiling continuously, creating steam that offered some relief from the bitter cold. She opened the oven door and let the heat from the pilot light help warm the small space. "It's going to be okay, baby," she whispered to Marcus, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. "Mama's got food, and we're going to stay warm right here in the kitchen." The stockpile of ingredients she had bought for her restaurant became their salvation. Canned goods, dried beans, rice flour, and various seasonings lined the shelves. She had enough food to last several days, maybe even a week if she was careful. It was the one blessing in an otherwise desperate situation. By the second day, the cold had become unbearable. Keisha wrapped herself and Marcus in every piece of fabric she could find, creating a cocoon of blankets and coats around them as they huddled near the stove. The candles had burned down to stubs, and she was rationing the remaining ones carefully. Marcus had developed a slight cough that worried her constantly. She held him against her chest, feeling his small body shake with each cough, and wondered how long they could survive in these conditions. The snow outside had piled so high against the windows that it blocked most of the natural light, making the house feel like a tomb. On the third night, as she sat in the dark listening to the wind howl like an angry beast, Keisha heard something that made her freeze. It was faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the storm itself, but as she listened more carefully, the sound became unmistakable. Motorcycle engines, the deep rumbling growl of multiple Harley-Davidson motorcycles cutting through the storm like mechanical thunder. The sound grew louder and closer until it seemed to surround her house completely. Through the small gap in the snow-covered window, she could see the flickering glow of headlights approaching. Who would be riding motorcycles in this weather? She whispered to herself, clutching Marcus tighter. The engines grew louder and louder until they seemed to shake the very foundation of her house. Then suddenly, they stopped. The silence that followed was somehow more frightening than the noise had been. Keisha's heart pounded in her chest as she strained to hear what was happening outside. Heavy footsteps crunched through the snow, multiple sets of boots making their way toward her front door. She could hear muffled voices, deep and rough, speaking in low tones she couldn't quite make out. Marcus stirred in her arms, awakening from his fitful sleep. Then came the knock. 3 deliberate raps on her front door that echoed through the cold house like gunshots. Keisha's breath caught in her throat. In all her years of living in the isolated house at the end of Maple Street, no one had ever come to her door during a storm, especially not anyone riding motorcycles through a blizzard. The knock came again, more insistent this time, followed by a voice that carried through the wind. "Ma'am, we need help. We're freezing out here." Keisha's mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. Who were these people? What did they want? And why had they chosen her house of all places to stop at during the worst storm in 20 years? Marcus began to cry softly, as if he could sense his mother's fear. Keisha rocked him gently, trying to calm both him and herself as she stared at the front door and wondered if opening it would save them or destroy them. The wind howled louder and the knock came a third time. The third knock echoed through the house like a gunshot, and Keisha felt her heart slam against her ribs. Marcus whimpered in her arms, sensing his mother's terror through the way her body had gone rigid. She pressed her back against the kitchen wall, as far from the front door as she could get, while still being able to hear what was happening outside. "Please, ma'am," the voice called again, rougher now, but with an edge of desperation. "We're not here to hurt anyone. We just need to get out of this storm." Through the gap in the snow-covered window, Keisha could make out dark shapes moving in the swirling white. The headlights of the motorcycles cut through the blizzard like angry eyes, casting long shadows that danced across her yard. She counted at least 6 or 7 bikes, maybe more. Her mind immediately went to every news story she had ever heard about motorcycle gangs, every warning her mother had given her about dangerous men who rode in packs. "Think, Keisha, think," she whispered to herself, bouncing Marcus gently as he began to fuss. She crept closer to the front window, staying low and keeping Marcus close to her chest. What she saw made her blood turn to ice. 25 men in heavy leather jackets stood in her front yard, their faces hidden behind helmets and scarves. Snow clung to their shoulders and arms, and even from inside the house, she could see how they shivered and stamped their feet against the cold. The man at the front of the group was enormous. Even bundled in winter gear, his size was intimidating. He had removed his helmet, revealing a weathered face framed by a thick beard that was already accumulating snow. His eyes, visible even through the storm, were sharp and alert. When he looked directly at her window, Keisha ducked down quickly, her heart hammering. "We know you're in there," he called out, his voice carrying easily over the wind. "We can see the candlelight. Look, I know this is scary, but we're not going anywhere in this weather. We can either freeze to death out here, or you can let us wait it out inside. We'll leave the moment the storm passes." Keisha's hands trembled as she held Marcus tighter. Every instinct screamed at her to stay hidden, to wait them out, and hope they would eventually leave. She had seen enough movies and heard enough stories to know what happened when women opened their doors to strange men in the middle of the night, especially women like her alone, invulnerable with no one to call for help. But as she watched through the window, she saw one of the men stumble and nearly fall. Another reached out to steady him, and she could see dark stains on his pants that looked suspiciously like blood. These weren't men looking for trouble. These were men in genuine distress. Marcus coughed again, a harsh sound that reminded her how cold the house had become. If these men were suffering in the storm outside, they probably weren't much worse off than she and her son were inside. At least they had each other. She had been alone with her fear for 3 days now, and the isolation was starting to feel more dangerous than whatever waited outside her door. The memory of her mother's voice suddenly filled her mind, as clear as if she were standing right beside her. It was something her mother had said countless times during Keisha's childhood, usually when they encountered homeless people or strangers asking for help. "Baby girl, when someone's in trouble, you help them. Doesn't matter what they look like or where they come from. You help them, because one day, you might be the one who needs helping. The good Lord sees everything, and what you give out comes back to you tenfold." Her mother had lived by those words, even when it meant giving away their last $10 to someone who claimed they needed bus fare. Even when it meant inviting strange neighbors over for dinner when they looked hungry. Even when her father had complained that she was too trusting, too willing to see the good in people who might not deserve it. "Help the traveler in need," her mother had always said, "even if he looks like your enemy." Keisha looked down at Marcus, who was staring up at her with complete trust in his dark eyes. He was depending on her to make the right choice to keep him safe and warm, but keeping him safe might mean taking a risk that terrified her to her core. Another knock came gentler this time. "Ma'am, we've got a man out here who's hurt pretty bad. He's been bleeding for hours, and the cold isn't helping. I'm begging you just until the storm passes. We'll sleep on the floor. We won't touch anything. We just need to get warm." Keisha closed her eyes and tried to think clearly. She could hear the pain in the man's voice now, the genuine desperation. These weren't the voices of predators. These were the voices of people who were as scared and cold as she was. She stood up slowly, careful not to startle Marcus, who was watching her every move with worried eyes, and walked toward the front door. Her legs felt like jelly, and every step seemed to take forever. When she reached the door, she pressed her forehead against the cold wood and tried to summon courage she wasn't sure she possessed. "Are you really hurt?" she called through the door. "Yes, ma'am. Danny here took a bad spill about 10 miles back. We've been trying to find shelter ever since." "How many of you are there?" 25, ma'am. I know that sounds like a lot, but we stick together. We don't leave anyone behind. 25. The number hit her like a physical blow. 25 strange men in her tiny house with her and her baby. It was either the most foolish thing she could possibly do, or it was exactly what her mother would have done in the same situation. Marcus reached up and touched her face with his small hand, his fingers cold but gentle. He babbled something unintelligible, but his tone was encouraging, as if he were trying to tell her everything would be okay. "Mama's scared, baby," she whispered, "but maybe being scared isn't always wrong. Maybe sometimes you have to be scared and brave at the same time." She took a deep breath, unlocked the deadbolt, and slowly opened the door. The man standing directly in front of her was even larger than she had imagined. His leather jacket was covered in patches and pins she didn't recognize, and his beard was streaked with gray. But when their eyes met, she saw something she hadn't expected: kindness, exhaustion, gratitude, and beneath it all, a gentleness that seemed completely at odds with his intimidating appearance. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm Mike. We won't forget this." Behind him, the other 24 men stood in the swirling snow waiting for permission to enter. They looked like a scene from a movie about outlaws and rebels, but as Keisha looked closer, she saw what Mike saw: men who were cold-tired and genuinely grateful for her kindness. "Come in," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Come in, before you all freeze to death." As the first man stepped across her threshold, shaking snow from his jacket and stomping his boots on her doormat, Keisha realized she had just made a decision that would change everything. For better or worse, she was no longer alone. One by one, the 25 men filed through Keisha's front door, each one carefully wiping their boots on the small mat before stepping inside. What struck her immediately was how quietly they moved, how deliberately they avoided making any sudden movements that might frighten her or Marcus. These weren't the wild, reckless bikers she had seen in movies. They moved with the disciplined precision of soldiers. Mike entered last, closing the door firmly behind him and immediately turning the deadbolt. When he saw Keisha's startled expression, he held up his hands in a peaceful gesture. "Just keeping the cold out, ma'am, and keeping you safe while we're here." The small house suddenly felt impossibly cramped. 25 large men in heavy leather jackets filled every available space in her living room and kitchen. But instead of the chaos she had expected, there was an almost reverent quiet as they looked around her modest home. Some removed their helmets and gloves, revealing faces that were weathered and scarred, but not unkind. "Thank you," said a younger man near the door, his voice barely above a whisper. "You have no idea what this means." Marcus peeked out from behind his pile of blankets, his eyes wide with curiosity rather than fear. One of the bikers, a man with graying temples and gentle eyes, noticed him watching and gave a small wave. Marcus ducked behind the blankets, then slowly emerged again, fascinated despite himself. "Is that your little boy?" the man asked Keisha softly. "Yes, that's Marcus. He's 2. Beautiful child. I'm Tommy. I've got grandkids about his age." Keisha felt some of her tension ease. Tommy looked more like someone's grandfather than a dangerous criminal. His leather jacket was worn and patched but clean. His beard was neatly trimmed, and when he smiled at Marcus, genuine warmth crinkled the corners of his eyes. Mike stepped forward, and Keisha noticed for the first time how he favored his left leg. "Ma'am, I need to be straight with you about something. We've got a man here who's hurt pretty bad. Danny took a spill on the ice about 10 miles back, and he's been bleeding ever since. Do you have any first aid supplies?" Keisha looked where Mike was pointing and saw a young man sitting heavily on her couch. His face was pale, and dark stains covered the left leg of his jeans. Even from across the room, she could see that his hands were shaking. "I have some things," she said, already moving toward the bathroom. "Let me get my supplies." She returned with a plastic container filled with bandages, antiseptic, and medical tape. As she knelt beside Danny, she could see that he was younger than the rest, maybe in his mid-20s. His eyes were glassy with pain, and when she gently touched his leg to examine the wound, he winced but didn't pull away. "This is pretty deep," she said, looking up at Mike. "He really should see a doctor." "Can't get to one in this storm," Mike replied. "Roads are completely blocked. We've been trying to get him help for hours." Keisha looked down at the young man's pale face and made a decision. "I can clean it and bandage it, but you need to keep pressure on it to stop the bleeding." As she worked carefully cleaning the wound and applying antiseptic, the other men watched in complete silence. She could feel their eyes on her, but there was no threat in their attention. Instead, she sensed something she hadn't expected: respect. "You're good at this," Danny said weakly as she wrapped his leg with clean bandages. "My mother was a nurse before she opened her restaurant," Keisha replied. "She taught me a few things." While she worked on Danny's injury, the other men had begun organizing themselves without being asked. Some had moved to the kitchen and were examining her meager food supplies. Others were checking the windows and doors, not in a threatening way, but as if securing the perimeter was second nature to them. "Ma'am," said a man with a thick southern accent, "would it be all right if we made some food? We've got some rations in our packs, and it looks like you've got ingredients here. We could make enough for everyone." "Please call me Keisha," she said, finishing with Danny's bandage. "And yes, I've got plenty of food. I was trying to run a restaurant out of here." Mike's eyebrows rose with interest. "A restaurant? What kind of food?" "Soul food. My mother's recipes. Fried chicken mostly." "Your mother's fried chicken," repeated Tommy with a grin. "Well, now we're talking. Haven't had real home cooking in months." As the evening progressed, something remarkable began to happen. The kitchen filled with the sounds of cooking and quiet conversation. Several of the men turned out to be surprisingly good cooks, working together to prepare a meal that combined Keisha's ingredients with their own trail rations. The smell of seasoned chicken and vegetables soon filled the cold house, making it feel warm and alive in a way it hadn't in months. Marcus gradually emerged from his hiding spot, drawn by the gentle voices and the promise of food. Tommy sat cross-legged on the floor, showing Marcus how to build towers with empty food cans. Other men joined in, their rough hands surprisingly gentle as they played simple games with the toddler. "He's a smart one," observed a man named Jake, watching Marcus stack the cans with intense concentration. "Reminds me of my nephew back in Tennessee." As they sat down to eat, crowded around Keisha's small table and on the floor, Mike cleared his throat. "Keisha, I think we owe you an explanation about who we are and why we were out in this storm." She looked around at the assembled faces, some young, some old, all watching her with serious expressions. "We're mostly veterans," Mike began. "Army, Marines, Navy. We served together in different units over the years, and when we came home, we found it hard to fit back into regular life. The brotherhood we had over there, the sense of purpose. It was hard to find that in the civilian world. So, we found each other," added Tommy. "Started riding together, taking care of each other the way we did in service." "We're not a gang," said Jake firmly. "We don't deal drugs or hurt people. We're just men who needed a family, and we made one for ourselves." Danny, looking better after the food and medical attention, spoke up from his spot on the couch. "We were riding to a Christmas gathering in Chicago. All the chapters from the Midwest come together every year to do charity work. Toys for kids, food for families who need it. The storm caught us by surprise," Mike continued. "Weather reports said it wouldn't hit until tomorrow. We were trying to make it to a motel when Danny's bike hit that patch of ice." Keisha listened to their stories with growing amazement. These weren't the dangerous criminals she had imagined. They were men who had served their country, who had struggled to find their place in a world that didn't always understand them, and who had created their own support system to help each other survive. "I know what people think when they see us," Mike said quietly. "The leather, the bikes, the tattoos. They see outlaws and troublemakers, but we're not. We're just trying to take care of our own and maybe help some other people along the way." As Mike spoke, Keisha felt a familiar pain in her chest, the pain of being judged by appearances, of having people make assumptions about who you were based on how you looked. She thought about Mrs. Henderson's cruel words about the employers who wouldn't hire her, about the neighbors who crossed the street when they saw her coming. "I understand," she said softly. "People look at me and see a single black mother in a poor neighborhood, and they think they know everything about me. They think I'm lazy or irresponsible, or that I must have done something wrong to end up where I am." The room fell silent except for the crackling of candles and the distant howl of wind outside. Mike's expression had grown distant, his eyes focused on something far beyond the walls of her small house. "I had a daughter once," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Emily. She was 6 years old, beautiful little girl with blonde pigtails and the biggest smile you ever saw." His hands clenched and unclenched in his lap. "Leukemia took her 3 years ago. Fought for 18 months, but the cancer won." Several of the men shifted uncomfortably, but none spoke. This was clearly painful territory that Mike rarely visited. Her mother blamed me, he continued. Said if I'd been a better provider, if I'd had better insurance, maybe we could have gotten her into better treatment programs. Maybe she'd still be alive. His voice cracked slightly. After Emily died, my wife left, said she couldn't look at me without seeing what we'd lost. Keisha felt tears welling in her eyes. Mike, I'm so sorry. Point is, Mike said, looking directly at her, people think they know why I ride with these guys. Think it's because I'm running from responsibility or looking for trouble. Truth is, I'm running from an empty house and a marriage that died with my little girl. These men, they're the only family I have left. The vulnerability in his voice seemed to break something open in the room. Keisha found herself speaking before she had consciously decided to share her own story. My husband left 8 months ago, she said, her voice steady despite the pain the words carried. Jerome said he couldn't handle the pressure of being a father, couldn't handle being poor, said he needed to find himself. She let out a bitter laugh. Turns out he found himself with a 23-year-old waitress in Tennessee. Did he ever see Marcus help support him? Asked Tommy gently. Not once. Not a phone call. Not a dollar, nothing. It's like we never existed. Keisha wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. People see me struggling, and they assume I picked a bad man, or that I was careless, or that I'm just another statistic. They don't see that I loved someone who promised to love me back, and that I'm doing everything I can to give my son a good life. Sometimes life just breaks people, Mike said simply, and sometimes it breaks the people who love them too. The shared pain seemed to settle over the room like a warm blanket. These were people who understood loss, who knew what it meant to have the world judge you for circumstances beyond your control. But you opened your door anyway, Mike said, even though you were scared, even though you had every reason not to trust us. My mother always told me to help people who were in trouble, Keisha replied. She said that when you turn away from someone who needs help, you're really turning away from yourself. Marcus had fallen asleep in Tommy's lap, his small body relaxed and peaceful. The sight of her son sleeping safely in the arms of a man she had been terrified of just hours earlier made Keisha's eyes fill with tears. Thank you, she whispered. All of you. I haven't felt this safe in my own home for a long time. Mike nodded solemnly. Neither have we, Keisha. Neither have we. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the small house at the end of Maple Street, 25 strangers and a single mother had found something precious and rare, a place where they could simply be human beings taking care of each other. As the evening wore on, the small house settled into an unusual but comfortable rhythm. The 25 bikers had arranged themselves throughout the living room and kitchen, some sitting on the floor with their backs against the walls, others sprawled on cushions they had pulled from the couch. The candlelight flickered across weathered faces that had relaxed into expressions of genuine contentment. For the first time in months, Keisha's house felt truly warm, not just from the body heat of 25 additional people, but from something deeper. The loneliness that had pressed down on her for so long seemed to lift like a physical weight, being removed from her shoulders. She moved through her own home with a lightness she had almost forgotten existed. Marcus had claimed Tommy as his new best friend, insisting on showing him every toy he owned and chattering away in the half-words and gestures that only 2-year-olds could master. Tommy listened with the patience of a man who truly understood children, responding to Marcus's babbling as if it were the most important conversation he had ever had. He's got good instincts about people, Mike observed, watching Marcus attempt to braid Tommy's beard. Kids always know. He's been so lonely, Keisha said quietly. It's just been the two of us for so long. He's not used to having this many people around, but he seems to love it. We all do, said Jake from his spot near the window. Been a long time since any of us sat around a family table like this. Danny had been dozing on the couch, his color much better after the meal and medical attention. But around midnight, Mike noticed that Danny was shifting restlessly, making small sounds of discomfort. He approached quietly and placed his hand on Danny's forehead. His skin was burning hot. Guys, wake up, Mike called urgently, his voice cutting through the peaceful atmosphere. Danny's burning up with fever. The men stirred immediately, their military training kicking in as they responded to the alarm in their leader's voice. Within seconds, 24 bikers were gathered around the couch, their faces etched with concern as they looked down at their friend. What do we do? Asked Pete, his voice tight with worry. This is bad, Mike. Really bad. Should we try to get him to a hospital? Suggested Jake. Maybe the roads are clear enough now. Mike shook his head grimly. Roads are still blocked solid. I checked an hour ago. We're not getting anywhere until this storm passes completely." Tommy knelt beside the couch and touched Danny's face gently. "He's burning up. This isn't just a regular fever. In Afghanistan, when guys got fever like this, the medics would," started one of the younger men, then trailed off helplessly. "But we don't have any medics here. We need to cool him down somehow," said Mike, but his voice betrayed his uncertainty. "But I don't know how." "Hell, I don't know anything about taking care of sick people." The men looked at each other with growing panic. These were tough individuals who had faced combat, who had survived dangerous situations around the world, but the sight of their friend burning up with fever had reduced them to helpless confusion. "What if he gets worse?" whispered Pete. "What if we lose him?" "We're not losing anybody," Mike said firmly, but Keisha could hear the fear beneath his determined words. From her spot in the kitchen, Keisha had been listening to their increasingly desperate conversation. She watched these strong men struggle with their friend's condition, saw the genuine terror in their eyes at the thought of losing Danny. Their helplessness was heartbreaking. She stepped forward quietly. "Mike, I can help." All 24 men turned to look at her, their expressions a mixture of hope and desperation. "You know about this stuff?" Mike asked, not bothering to hide the relief in his voice. "Some. My mother was a nurse before she opened her restaurant. She taught me how to handle fevers and basic medical care." "Please," said Tommy, his voice breaking slightly. "We don't know what to do. We'll try anything." Keisha looked around at the circle of worried faces. These were men who had faced combat, who had survived tours in dangerous places around the world, but the sight of their friend burning up with fever had reduced them to anxious uncertainty. They reminded her of Marcus when he was scared and looking to her for comfort. "It's okay," she said calmly. "Fever is the body's way of fighting infection. We just need to keep him cool and make sure he stays hydrated." She disappeared into the bathroom and returned with a basin of cool water and several washcloths. Settling herself on the edge of the couch beside Danny, she began gently bathing his face and neck with the cool cloths. "Danny, honey, can you hear me?" she said softly. His eyes fluttered open, glassy and unfocused. Where am I?" "You're safe," Keisha replied, her voice taking on the gentle tone she used with Marcus when he was sick. "You're in my house and your friends are here. You have a fever, but I'm going to take care of you." For the next several hours, Keisha moved between the kitchen and the living room, boiling water for tea, preparing cool compresses, and monitoring Danny's temperature. The other bikers watched her work with something approaching awe. She moved with quiet efficiency, her hands steady and sure as she tended to their friend. "Mama," Danny mumbled during one of his delirious moments, reaching out blindly. Without hesitation, Keisha took his hand in hers. "I'm here, baby. You're going to be fine." Mike stood in the doorway, watching this exchange, his expression unreadable. When Keisha looked up and caught his eye, she saw something there that made her chest tighten. Respect, certainly. Gratitude. But also something deeper. Recognition. As if he was seeing something in her that he had been looking for but hadn't expected to find. Around 3 in the morning, Danny's fever finally broke. His breathing became easier, and the tight lines of pain around his eyes relaxed. Keisha felt his forehead one more time and smiled with relief. "He's going to be okay," she announced to the room full of anxious men. "The fever's broken. He should sleep peacefully now." A collective sigh of relief went around the room. Pete actually wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, and Tommy patted Keisha's shoulder with gentle gratitude. "You saved his life," Mike said quietly. "We wouldn't have known what to do." "He saved mine too," Keisha replied. "All of you did. I haven't felt this useful, this needed in a very long time." As dawn approached, the storm outside finally began to show signs of weakening. The wind had died down to a steady whisper, and the snow was falling more gently. The men began to stir, checking the weather and discussing their departure. Mike found Keisha in the kitchen, where she was preparing coffee and scrambled eggs for breakfast. "We'll be leaving soon," he said. "Roads should be passable in a few hours." Keisha nodded, surprised by how much the thought of their departure saddened her. "I'll pack some food for the road. You've got a long ride ahead of you." "Keisha," Mike said, his voice serious, "what you did for us for Danny. We don't forget things like that. We take care of people who take care of us." She looked up from the eggs she was scrambling, meeting his intense gaze. "I didn't do anything special. Anyone would have done the same." Mike shook his head slowly. "No, they wouldn't. Most people would have left us out in that storm. Most people see us and cross to the other side of the street. but you opened your door. You fed us. You healed our friend. You treated us like family." "You are family," Keisha said simply. "At least you feel like family to me." When the time came for them to leave, the goodbye was more emotional than anyone had expected. Each man shook Keisha's hand or hugged her gently, thanking her with words that seemed inadequate for what they were trying to express. Marcus cried when Tommy had to leave, clinging to the older man's leather jacket with heartbreaking determination. "I'll see you again, little man," Tommy promised, his own voice thick with emotion. "That's a promise." Mike was the last to leave. He pressed an envelope into Keisha's hands, despite her protests. "It's not charity," he said firmly. "It's payment for services rendered. You're a healer, and healers deserve to be compensated for their work." "I can't take your money," Keisha said, trying to hand the envelope back. "You can, and you will. We don't leave debts unpaid." His expression softened slightly. "Besides that little restaurant of yours, the one with your mother's recipes, don't give up on it. Good food and good hearts like yours will find their way to each other." Keisha stood in her doorway, holding Marcus on her hip, watching 25 motorcycles disappear into the gray morning. The envelope in her pocket felt heavy with possibility, but heavier still was the knowledge that she was once again alone. The house felt enormous and silent after they left. She and Marcus ate breakfast in a kitchen that seemed too big for just two people, but something had changed during the night. The loneliness was still there, but it felt different now. Less like a permanent condition and more like a temporary state of being. "Mama," Marcus said, pointing toward the door. "Friends, come back." Keisha looked at her son's hopeful face and smiled. "I don't know, baby, but if they need us, I think they will." She opened the envelope Mike had given her and gasped. There was more money inside than she made in 3 months at any of her previous jobs. Enough to pay her rent, fix her heater, and maybe even buy some proper equipment for her restaurant. But more valuable than the money was the note written in Mike's careful handwriting for Mama Keisha, who showed us what family really means. We won't forget. The Brotherhood. For the first time in years, Keisha Williams went to bed, believing that tomorrow might be better than today. 3 days after the Hells Angels had disappeared into the gray morning, Keisha's house felt like a tomb. The silence pressed against her ears with an almost physical weight, broken only by Marcus's occasional babbling as he played with his toys. She had grown so accustomed to the sound of 25 voices, the gentle rumble of conversation, and the warmth of shared meals, that the emptiness now felt suffocating. The money Mike had left sat on her kitchen table in neat stacks. $800, more than she had seen at one time in years. Enough to pay the overdue electric bill, buy groceries for a month, maybe even fix the heater. But somehow, looking at those bills felt like staring at the remnants of a beautiful dream that was already fading. She had tried to restart her restaurant business using some of the money to buy fresh ingredients and making a new sign for her window, but the cruel reality hadn't changed. In 3 days, exactly 0 customers had walked through her door. The smell of her mother's fried chicken had filled the house with hope and memory, but hope didn't pay bills and memory didn't feed a hungry child. By the 4th day, the food she had prepared was beginning to spoil. Marcus had developed a cold that made him fussy and clingy, crying for hours despite her efforts to comfort him. The house felt colder somehow, as if the warmth the bikers had brought with them had been sucked out through the cracks in the walls when they left. "Mama hungry," Marcus whimpered from his high chair, pushing away the small portion of scrambled eggs she had made him. It was the 3rd meal in a row he had refused, and Keisha was beginning to panic. She opened the refrigerator and stared at its meager contents. The milk was nearly gone, and she couldn't afford to buy more until she figured out how to stretch the money Mike had given her. The sight of her hungry child refusing food because he was too sick to eat properly made her stomach clench with a familiar desperation. "Come on, baby," she pleaded, trying to spoon more egg into his mouth. "Just a little bit. For Mama." Marcus turned his head away and began to cry, a thin, wailing sound that seemed to echo off the empty walls. His nose was running, and his small body shook with each sob. Keisha picked him up and held him close, feeling how warm he was getting, the beginning of a fever. She looked at the pile of money on the table and realized with growing horror that she had a choice to make. Use the money for medicine and food for Marcus, or save it for the rent that was due in 2 weeks. There wasn't enough for both. The decision was no decision at all. Her son came first, always. She bundled Marcus in his warmest coat and stepped outside into the cold afternoon air. The walk to Mrs. Henderson's house felt like a march to execution, but she had run out of options. Mrs. Henderson was the closest neighbor, and despite their previous encounter, she was Keisha's best hope for help. The older woman's house was neat and well-maintained, with a perfectly manicured lawn that even in winter looked better than Keisha's yard ever had. She climbed the front steps with Marcus on her hip, his fevered face buried against her shoulder, and knocked on the door. Mrs. Henderson answered after the third knock, her expression immediately souring when she saw who was standing on her porch. "What do you want?" she asked, not bothering with pleasantries. "Mrs. Henderson, I'm sorry to bother you, but my son is sick, and I was wondering if you might have some children's medicine I could borrow, or maybe just a little milk I can pay you back as soon as—" "Absolutely not." Mrs. Henderson's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "I told you before, I don't want anything to do with your kind of trouble." "Please," Keisha said, hearing the desperation creep into her voice. "He's just a baby. He has a fever, and I need to get some medicine in him, but I can't afford both medicine and milk, and he won't take the medicine without—" "That's not my problem." Mrs. Henderson started to close the door, but Keisha stepped forward, her hand reaching out instinctively. "Wait, please. I'm begging you. Just this once. I'll do anything." Mrs. Henderson's face twisted with disgust. "Get your hands off my door and get off my property before I call the police." "Mrs. Henderson, please, he's burning up. I said, get off my property." The older woman shoved Keisha backward with surprising force. Already off balance from carrying Marcus, Keisha stumbled down the front steps and fell hard onto the frozen sidewalk. Marcus screamed as they hit the ground, and Keisha felt a sharp pain shoot through her elbow where it had struck the concrete. "Stay away from decent people," Mrs. Henderson called from her doorway. "Take your bastard child and your welfare problems somewhere else. This is a respectable neighborhood." The door slammed shut with a finality that echoed through Keisha's chest like a physical blow. She sat on the cold sidewalk holding her crying son, feeling the sting of tears on her cheeks and the deeper sting of humiliation in her heart. "Mama hurt," Marcus sobbed, reaching up to touch her face. "I know, baby. Mama's hurt too." She struggled to her feet, her elbow throbbing and her pride shattered into pieces she wasn't sure she could ever put back together. The walk home felt endless, with Marcus's weight seeming to increase with every step, and the cold seeping through her worn coat like a living thing. As she passed the last house on the block, she heard a voice call out behind her. "Honey, are you all right?" Keisha turned to see an elderly black woman standing in the doorway of a small house she had never really noticed before. The woman looked to be in her 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and kind eyes that were filled with concern. "I saw what happened over there," the woman said, stepping out onto her porch despite the cold. "That Henderson woman is nothing but meanness wrapped up in Sunday clothes. You come here, child. Both of you look like you need some help." Keisha hesitated. After the cruel rejection she had just experienced, kindness felt almost foreign. But Marcus was still burning with fever, and she was out of options. "I don't want to be any trouble," she said weakly. "Trouble?" The woman laughed, a warm sound that seemed to chase away some of the cold. "Honey, helping folks in need isn't trouble. It's what we're supposed to do. I'm Martha, and you're coming inside right now before that baby catches pneumonia." Martha's house was small, but immaculately clean, filled with the smell of fresh bread and something else that reminded Keisha of her mother's kitchen. Family, love, home. "Sit yourself down right there," Martha instructed, pointing to a comfortable armchair near the fireplace. "Let me look at this little angel." Martha examined Marcus with the gentle expertise of someone who had raised children of her own. She checked his temperature, looked in his throat, and listened to his breathing with an old stethoscope she pulled from a kitchen drawer. "He's got a little cold, but nothing that won't clear up with some rest and proper care," she announced. "I've got children's medicine in the bathroom, and there's fresh milk in the refrigerator. You just sit tight while I get everything together." Keisha watched in amazement as Martha bustled around her kitchen, preparing warm milk with honey, gathering medicine, and even wrapping up some of the fresh bread she had been baking. The older woman moved with the efficiency of someone accustomed to taking care of people, and her kindness felt like a warm blanket after hours in the cold. "Why are you helping us?" Keisha asked quietly as Martha handed her the medicine for Marcus. Martha paused, her hand touching a silver necklace that hung around her neck. It was an unusual piece, old-looking, with intricate engravings that caught the firelight. "Because I know what it's like to be alone and scared with a sick child," Martha said simply, "and because my mama always told me that kindness comes back to you when you need it most." She pressed a small envelope into Keisha's hands, along with a bag of groceries. "This should help with whatever bills are pressing on you, and don't you dare try to refuse it." "I've got more money than I need and no children to spend it on." Marcus had already begun to perk up after taking the medicine, and he was currently fascinated by a small music box Martha had given him to play with. The sight of her son smiling for the first time in days made Keisha's eyes fill with tears. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. "You don't need to thank me, honey. You just take care of that beautiful baby, and remember that there are still good people in this world. More good than bad, even if it doesn't always feel that way." As Keisha walked home with Marcus in her arms and Martha's gifts in her hands, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Real, tangible hope that maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be okay. She didn't know that 3 days later, her quiet street would be filled with the thunder of 1,500 motorcycles, or that the kindness Martha had shown her would turn out to be connected to the kindness she had shown 25 strangers in a snowstorm. Sometimes the universe works in ways that are too perfect to be coincidence, and sometimes the smallest acts of compassion create ripples that travel farther than anyone could imagine. 3 days had passed since Martha's kindness had pulled Keisha back from the brink of despair. Marcus was feeling much better, his fever completely gone, and his appetite returned with a vengeance. The medicine and care had worked their magic, and he was back to his cheerful, curious self, babbling happily as he played with the small toys Martha had given him. Keisha had used Martha's money wisely, buying groceries and paying the most urgent bills. The envelope had contained $200 and a note written in careful handwriting. "For a mother who reminds me of myself at your age. Keep your chin up, honey. Better days are coming." She was in the kitchen preparing lunch when she felt it. A vibration so faint at first that she thought it might be a large truck passing by on the main road. But the trembling didn't stop. Instead, it grew stronger, traveling up through the floorboards and into the soles of her feet. Marcus looked up from his toys, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Mama, what that?" The vibration intensified until the dishes in her cabinets began to rattle softly. Keisha moved to the front window and peered through the curtains, but the street appeared empty. Yet the rumbling sound was growing louder, deeper, like distant thunder that refused to move on. Then she saw them. They appeared at the far end of Maple Street like a vision from another world. Motorcycles. Dozens of them. No, not dozens. Hundreds. An endless line of chrome and steel that stretched back beyond what she could see, flowing toward her house like a mechanical river. "Oh my God," she whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. The lead motorcycles reached her house and began to arrange themselves in precise formations along both sides of the street. Behind them came more and more until the quiet residential road looked like the staging area for the world's largest motorcycle rally. The thunderous rumble of 1,500 Harley-Davidson engines created a sound unlike anything Keisha had ever experienced, a mechanical symphony that seemed to shake the very air. Marcus had climbed onto a chair to look out the window, clapping his hands with delight at the spectacle. "Big bikes, Mama, so many big bikes." Keisha stood frozen in her doorway, trying to process what she was seeing. The motorcycles continued to arrive, their riders dismounting and arranging themselves in orderly lines. These weren't random bikers who had happened upon her street. This was organized. This was intentional. This was about her. The front door of every house on Maple Street opened as neighbors emerged to witness the unprecedented sight. Mrs. Henderson stood on her perfectly manicured lawn, her face pale with shock and what looked suspiciously like fear. Other neighbors gathered in small groups, pointing and whispering among themselves, their expressions ranging from amazement to terror. At the head of the massive formation, Keisha recognized a familiar figure. Mike sat on his bike, but he wasn't alone. Beside him were Tommy, Jake, Pete, and all the others who had spent that snowy night in her home. But behind them were hundreds more men and women wearing the same leather jackets, the same patches, the same expression of quiet determination. Mike dismounted and began walking toward her house. As he moved, the 1,500 engines behind him fell silent in perfect unison, creating a silence so complete that it felt almost supernatural. The sudden absence of sound was somehow more impressive than the thunder had been. "Keisha!" Mike called out, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "We need to talk." She stepped out onto her porch, Marcus on her hip, feeling the eyes of 1,500 bikers and dozens of neighbors focused on her. The magnitude of the moment pressed down on her like a physical weight. Mike, what is this? Why are you all here?" He stopped at the bottom of her front steps, his expression serious but not threatening. Behind him, the massive formation of motorcycles and riders waited with military precision. "We told you we don't forget," he said simply, "and we don't leave debts unpaid." A murmur ran through the crowd of neighbors, and Keisha could see Mrs. Henderson edging closer, her curiosity apparently overcoming her fear. "I don't understand," Keisha said, though part of her was beginning to suspect that something extraordinary was about to happen. Tommy appeared beside Mike, carrying a large manila envelope. "Keisha, that night you saved our lives. You fed us. You healed Danny. You treated us like family when the whole world treats us like criminals. We've been busy these past 3 days," added Jake, his usual jovial demeanor replaced by something more solemn. "Making phone calls, calling in favors, reaching out to every chapter from here to California." Mike gestured toward the assembled crowd behind him. "These are our brothers and sisters from across the country. Detroit, Chicago, Milwaukee, Cleveland, Pittsburgh. When we told them about what you did, about who you are, they wanted to meet you." A woman biker near the front of the formation stepped forward. She was tall and confident, with graying hair and kind eyes that reminded Keisha somehow of her mother. "I'm Sarah from the Chicago chapter," she said, her voice warm but strong. "We heard about a woman who opened her door to 25 strangers in a blizzard. We heard about a mother who saved a young man's life with nothing but kindness and home remedies. Word travels fast in our community," added another writer, this one from Cleveland. "Stories about real kindness, real courage, they spread like wildfire." Mike reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick envelope. "Keisha, this is from all of us. Every chapter contributed. It's enough to pay off every debt you have, fix up this house, and get your restaurant running properly." Keisha stared at the envelope, her mind struggling to process what was happening. "I can't take this. It's too much. I just did what anyone would do." "No," said Tommy firmly. "You did what almost no one would do. And that makes all the difference." The sound of news vans could be heard in the distance, their engines adding to the mechanical chorus. Word was spreading quickly that something unprecedented was happening on Maple Street. "There's more," Mike continued. "We've got contractors, electricians, plumbers all riding with us. We're going to fix this house properly, make it into the kind of restaurant it deserves to be." Sarah stepped forward again. "And we've got a marketing plan. Social media, word of mouth, food bloggers. By the time we're done, everyone in Detroit is going to know about Mama Keisha's kitchen." Keisha felt tears streaming down her cheeks as the magnitude of their generosity hit her. These people who had been strangers just days before had organized a support network that spanned multiple states. They had turned her small act of kindness into something that would change her life forever. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do all this for me?" Mike's expression softened, and for a moment she saw not the intimidating leader of a motorcycle club, but the grieving father who had lost his daughter. "Because you showed us what family really means," he said quietly. "You showed us that kindness still exists in this world. And because sometimes when someone saves your life, you get the chance to save theirs right back." The crowd of neighbors had grown larger, and Keisha could see camera phones recording everything. Mrs. Henderson stood at the edge of her lawn, her face a mask of confusion and what might have been the beginning of shame. Marcus wiggled in her arms, wanting to get down and see the motorcycles up close. Tommy stepped forward with a gentle smile. "Can I?" he asked, and when Keisha nodded, he took Marcus in his arms. The toddler immediately began pointing at the bikes and chattering excitedly. "Big bikes. So many big bikes." "That's right, little man," Tommy said warmly. "And every single one of them came here because your mama is the bravest, kindest woman we know." As if responding to some invisible signal, the 1,500 bikers began to move. They didn't mount their motorcycles or rev their engines. Instead, they began walking toward Keisha's house, each one carrying something. Tools, building supplies, paint, lumber, kitchen equipment. Everything needed to transform her small home into a proper restaurant. "We're going to get to work," Mike announced. "And we're not leaving until Mama Keisha's kitchen is ready to serve the best soul food in Detroit." the transformation of Maple Street from a quiet residential road into a construction site, unlike anything the neighborhood had ever seen, was about to begin. And at the center of it all stood a single mother who had opened her door to strangers in a storm, never imagining that her kindness would summon an army of angels on motorcycles. Within an hour, Keisha's quiet street had transformed into something resembling a small-town festival. The 1,500 Hells Angels had organized themselves with military precision, creating work crews that tackled different aspects of renovating her house. Some focused on the exterior, others on plumbing and electrical work, while a dedicated team worked on expanding and modernizing her small kitchen. The neighbors, initially shocked into silence, had gradually emerged from their houses to witness the unprecedented spectacle. Word had spread quickly through the community, and people from blocks away were walking over to see what was happening. Children pressed their faces against windows, wide-eyed, at the sight of so many motorcycles lined up like mechanical soldiers. Local news vans had arrived, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky, as reporters attempted to make sense of the story unfolding before them. Camera crews captured every moment as leather-clad bikers wielded hammers and paintbrushes with the same skill they handled their motorcycles. Mrs. Henderson stood at the edge of her perfectly manicured lawn, her expression cycling between confusion, fear, and what might have been the beginning of recognition that she had badly misjudged the situation. She kept glancing between the organized chaos in Keisha's yard and the growing crowd of curious neighbors, her face pale and drawn. "I can't believe this is happening," whispered Mrs. Johnson from 2 houses down. "All these bikers just to help one woman." "Did you hear what she did?" replied Mr. Davis, an elderly man who rarely spoke to anyone. "Apparently she saved their lives in that big snowstorm last week. Fed them, took care of them when they were stranded." "Keisha did that." Mrs. Johnson looked surprised. "I had no idea she was even capable of—" Her voice trailed off as she realized what she was about to say and how it reflected on her own assumptions about her neighbor. In the midst of all this activity, Martha appeared at the edge of the crowd. The elderly woman had walked over from her small house, drawn by the noise and commotion like everyone else. She stood at the back of the gathering, her silver hair catching the afternoon light, watching the proceedings with curious eyes. Keisha was standing near her front porch, still overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening around her. Marcus had been claimed by Tommy and was currently getting a tour of the motorcycles, his delighted squeals audible over the sounds of construction. "This is incredible," Sarah from the Chicago chapter said, appearing beside Keisha with a clipboard covered in notes. "We've got the kitchen renovation mapped out, the dining room expansion planned, and enough volunteers to have everything finished by tomorrow evening." "Tomorrow?" Keisha shook her head in amazement. "That's impossible." "Honey, you haven't seen what happens when 1,500 motivated bikers decide to get something done." Sarah laughed. "We once built an entire playground in 6 hours for a children's hospital in Milwaukee." Danny emerged from the house looking much healthier than he had during that terrible night when his fever had spiked. He was carrying a toolbox and had paint streaks on his clothes, evidence that he had been working on the interior renovations. When he spotted Keisha, he walked over with a broad smile. "The kitchen is going to be amazing," he told her enthusiastically. "Professional-grade stove, expanded prep area, even a new freezer unit. You'll be able to handle 50 customers easy." "Danny, I still can't believe you all did this," Keisha said, her voice thick with emotion. "After everything I put you through that night?" "Put us through?" Danny looked genuinely confused. "Keisha, you saved my life. If you hadn't known how to break that fever, I could have died in that house." As he spoke, his hand unconsciously moved to touch something at his throat. It was then that Keisha noticed he was wearing a necklace she hadn't seen before. It was silver, old-looking, with intricate engravings that caught the light. "That's a beautiful necklace," she observed. Danny's expression grew soft and sad. "It belonged to my mother. I lost her when I was 7, got separated from her during a fire at our apartment building. This necklace was the only thing I had left of her. The family that took me in let me keep it, but I never found her again." From somewhere behind them in the crowd, there was a sharp intake of breath, a gasp so sudden and loud that it cut through the noise of construction and conversation. "Danny!" The voice was trembling, uncertain, filled with 30 years of hope and heartbreak. Everyone in the immediate area turned toward the sound, and there stood Martha, her face pale and her eyes fixed on the young man's necklace. "Danny, is that you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Danny froze, his hand still touching the silver chain at his throat. "I'm sorry, do we know each other?" Martha took a shaky step forward, her eyes never leaving his face. "You were 7 years old. There was a fire at the Riverside Apartments. You had a little birthmark shaped like a crescent moon just behind your left ear." Danny's hand moved instinctively to touch the spot she had mentioned, his eyes growing wide with disbelief. "How do you know about that?" he asked, his voice tight with emotion. "Because I'm your mother," Martha said, tears streaming down her face. "I'm your mother, and I've been looking for you for 30 years. The construction noise seemed to fade into background as everyone in the immediate area fell silent. Danny stared at the elderly woman, his face cycling through disbelief, hope, and recognition. "The necklace," Martha continued, her voice growing stronger. "I gave it to you for your 7th birthday. It belonged to my grandmother. There's an inscription on the back that says, 'Love never dies.'" With trembling fingers, Danny turned the pendant over, revealing the exact words Martha had just spoken. The silver was worn with age, but the engraving was still clearly visible. "Mama." Danny's voice broke on the word, 30 years of separation collapsing into a single moment of recognition. "Oh, my baby," Martha sobbed, rushing forward to embrace the son she had lost so long ago. "My beautiful baby boy." They collapsed into each other's arms, both crying too hard to speak. 30 years of searching, of wondering, of hoping against hope dissolved in an instant. Around them, the crowd of bikers and neighbors stood in stunned silence, witnessing a miracle that no one could have predicted. Mike stepped forward, his own eyes wet with tears. "Martha, you're Danny's mother." "I am," Martha said, her arms still wrapped around her son. "And you're the family that took care of him all these years." "We're his brothers," Tommy said simply. "And that makes you our mother too." The emotional weight of the moment seemed to ripple outward through the crowd. Hardened bikers wiped their eyes. Openly, neighbors who had never spoken to each other found themselves embracing, and even the news crews stopped filming to simply witness the power of a family reunited. "I don't understand," Mrs. Henderson said, pushing through the crowd. Her voice was shaky, confused. "How is this possible? What are the odds?" Keisha looked at the woman who had shoved her down just days before, who had called her child terrible names, and refused to help when help was desperately needed. The anger she expected to feel never came. Instead, she felt something closer to pity. "Sometimes kindness finds its way home," Keisha said quietly. "Sometimes when you help someone, you're really helping yourself without knowing it." Martha looked up from her reunion with Danny, her eyes finding Keisha's across the crowd. "You," she said with sudden understanding, "you're the woman who saved my son's life. You're the reason he survived that fever. And you're the woman who saved mine and Marcus's life when we had nowhere else to turn." Keisha replied, "I guess we've been taking care of each other's children without knowing it." The crowd erupted in cheers, the sound mixing with the revving of 1,500 motorcycles as the Hells Angels celebrated the impossible reunion they had inadvertently caused. In the space of a single week, a blizzard, an act of kindness, and a community of unlikely angels had brought together a mother and son who had been searching for each other for 3 decades. Mrs. Henderson stood at the edge of the celebration watching the joy unfold around her, and for the first time in years, she began to understand what she had been missing by keeping her heart closed to her neighbors. The celebration that erupted after Martha and Danny's reunion seemed to energize the entire street. What had started as a construction project had transformed into something resembling a neighborhood festival, with the Hells Angels working alongside curious neighbors who had gradually joined in to help. The barriers that had separated the community for so long were crumbling as quickly as the walls being knocked down in Keisha's house. By sunset, the transformation was nothing short of miraculous. The small house that had once barely contained a kitchen table and 2 folding chairs now boasted a proper restaurant space. The Hells Angels had worked with the efficiency of a professional construction crew, expanding the dining area, installing commercial-grade kitchen equipment, and even adding a cheerful sign above the front door that read, "Mama Keisha's Kitchen, where love is the secret ingredient." "I can't believe this is my house," Keisha said, standing in the doorway of what was now a proper restaurant kitchen. Professional stoves gleamed under new lighting, expanded counter space provided room for serious food preparation, and a walk-in cooler hummed quietly in the corner. "Believe it," said Sarah from the Chicago chapter, wiping paint from her hands with a satisfied smile. "And believe this too, We've already got your social media account set up and your story spreading across the internet. You're going to have more customers than you know what to do with." Martha had hardly left Danny's side since their reunion, but she approached Keisha with tears still shining in her eyes. "Honey, I need you to know something," Martha said, taking Keisha's hands in her weathered ones. "When I helped you the other day, I thought I was just doing what any decent person would do. I had no idea I was helping the woman who had saved my son's life." "And I had no idea the woman who saved me was Danny's mother," Keisha replied. "It's like the universe was trying to tell us something." "It was telling us that we're family," Martha said firmly. "All of us. You, me, Marcus, Danny, and every one of these angels on motorcycles." Mike appeared beside them, his leather jacket now dusty with construction debris, but his face glowing with satisfaction. "Keisha, we need to settle some business," he said, pulling out another envelope. "This contains the deed to your house. It's paid off completely. No more rent, no more landlord. This place belongs to you and Marcus now." Keisha stared at the legal documents in disbelief. "Mike, I can't accept this. It's too much." "You can, and you will," he said with the same firm tone he had used about the money. "A restaurant needs stability. You can't build a business if you're worried about where you're going to live." Danny stepped forward, his arm around Martha's shoulders. "Besides, we're going to be regular customers. Martha's already promised to help you perfect some of the old family recipes. And I've got some stories to tell about this young man's childhood that might help you understand why he's so stubborn about taking care of people," Martha added with a loving smile at her son. The news crews had captured every moment of the day's events, and word was already spreading beyond Detroit. The story of the single mother who had sheltered 25 Hell's Angels and inadvertently reunited a family was resonating with people across the country. Orders for Keisha's food were already coming in from people who wanted to support her restaurant. As evening approached, the neighbors who had spent the day watching from a distance began to approach more directly. Mrs. Johnson was the first to cross the street, carrying a covered dish. "I brought some cornbread," she said shyly. "I thought maybe we could all have dinner together, try out the new restaurant." "That sounds wonderful," Keisha replied, accepting the dish with genuine warmth. Mr. Davis shuffled over with his wife, both of them looking slightly overwhelmed by everything they had witnessed. "We wanted to apologize," Mrs. Davis said quietly. "We've lived next to you for 2 years and never once made an effort to get to know you. That was wrong of us." "We've all made mistakes," Keisha replied gently. "What matters is what we do going forward." Even some of the younger families from down the street had gathered their children, fascinated by the motorcycles and the bikers who patiently answered their questions about the machines. But it was Mrs. Henderson's approach that surprised everyone the most. The older woman walked slowly across the street, her face a mask of internal struggle. When she reached the group gathered around Keisha's front porch, she stopped and took a deep breath. "I owe you an apology," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "A big one. What I did the other day, how I treated you and your son, it was inexcusable." The crowd fell silent, all eyes focused on the woman who had been so cruel just days before. "I was wrong about you," Mrs. Henderson continued, her voice growing stronger. "I was wrong about a lot of things. Watching what happened here today, seeing how these people treat you like family, understanding what kind of person you really are. I'm ashamed of myself." Keisha looked at the woman who had shoved her down in the street, who had called her child terrible names, who had refused the simplest request for help. The anger she had expected to feel never came. Instead, she felt something closer to understanding. "We all have bad days, Mrs. Henderson," Keisha said quietly. "What matters is how we choose to move forward. I'd like to be a better neighbor," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice thick with emotion. "If you'll let me." "Everyone's welcome at Mama Keisha's kitchen," Keisha replied with a genuine smile. "Everyone." As the sun set over Maple Street, an impromptu block party began to take shape. The Hell's Angels had brought out grills and were cooking alongside neighbors who had contributed dishes from their own kitchens. Children ran between the motorcycles, their laughter mixing with the deeper voices of the bikers who had appointed themselves honorary uncles and aunts. Marcus had claimed his position as the unofficial mascot of the celebration, moving from person to person with the confidence of a child who had never known strangers, only friends he hadn't met yet. Tommy had fashioned him a miniature leather vest that read "Little Angel" on the back, and Marcus wore it with enormous pride. "Look, Mama!" Marcus called out, running to show off his vest. "I'm a big boy now." "You sure are, baby," Keisha replied, scooping him up for a hug. "You're the biggest, bravest boy I know." Martha had taken charge of organizing the community dinner, moving through the crowd with the efficiency of someone who had spent a lifetime bringing people together. She coordinated dishes, made sure everyone had enough to eat, and somehow managed to remember everyone's name within hours of meeting them. "This is what a neighborhood is supposed to feel like," she told Keisha as they watched the diverse group sharing food and stories. "This is what community really means." Mike found Keisha as the evening wound down, most of the work crews having finished their tasks. The transformation of her house was complete, and tomorrow would mark the official opening of Mama Keisha's kitchen. "I have one more thing for you," he said, pulling out a small leather journal. "This contains contact information for every chapter that contributed to today. If you ever need anything at all, you call us. You're part of the family now. Permanently." "Mike, I don't know how to thank you. Any of you. This is beyond anything I ever imagined." "You don't need to thank us," he replied. "You just need to keep being who you are. Keep opening your door to people who need help. Keep showing the world what real kindness looks like." As the Hells Angels began to mount their motorcycles for the journey back to their respective homes, the neighbors who had spent the day working alongside them gathered to say goodbye. Handshakes turned into hugs, email addresses were exchanged, and promises to stay in touch were made with genuine sincerity. "This isn't goodbye," Tommy told Marcus as he lifted the little boy up for one last hug. "Uncle Tommy is going to come visit all the time, and when you get big enough, maybe I'll teach you how to ride a motorcycle." "Really?" Marcus's eyes lit up with excitement. "Really? But first, you have to help your mama make this the best restaurant in Detroit." "I will, I promise." The 1,500 motorcycles that had filled Maple Street began to depart in small groups, their engines creating a symphony that seemed to carry with it the promise that this was not an ending, but a beginning. As the last of the bikes disappeared into the night, the street fell quiet except for the sounds of neighbors cleaning up together and children's laughter echoing through the warm summer air. Keisha stood in the doorway of her transformed home, holding Marcus on her hip with Martha and Danny beside her, and a street full of neighbors who were no longer strangers. The loneliness that had pressed down on her for so long was gone, replaced by something she had almost forgotten existed, a sense of belonging. "Mama," Marcus said sleepily, his head resting on her shoulder. "Are we happy now?" Keisha looked around at the faces of her new family at the restaurant that would let her build a future for her son, at the community that had embraced them both. "Yes, baby," she whispered, her voice full of wonder and gratitude. "We're happy now." Tomorrow would bring the grand opening of Mama Keisha's kitchen, and with it, the beginning of a new chapter, not just for Keisha and Marcus, but for an entire community that had learned what miracles were possible when people chose kindness over fear, understanding over judgment, and love over isolation. 6 months later, the transformation of Maple Street was complete in ways that went far beyond the physical renovation of Keisha's house. What had once been a divided neighborhood where people barely acknowledged each other had become a genuine community where children played together across property lines and neighbors gathered regularly for impromptu barbecues and block parties. Mama Keisha's kitchen had become more than just a restaurant. It was the beating heart of the neighborhood, a place where people from all walks of life came together over plates of perfectly seasoned fried chicken and sides that tasted like childhood memories. The walls were covered with photographs from that miraculous day when 1,500 Hells Angels had descended on their quiet street, turning it into a construction site powered by love and loyalty. The success had exceeded everyone's wildest expectations. Food critics from Detroit's major newspapers had written glowing reviews calling Keisha's cooking soulful perfection and a taste of authentic family tradition. A major food network had approached her about featuring the restaurant on a national show. Orders came in daily from people who had heard the story and wanted to support the woman who had opened her door to strangers in a storm. But for Keisha, the most meaningful measure of success wasn't found in newspaper reviews or television coverage. It was found in moments like this morning when she stood in her kitchen at 5 a.m. preparing for another busy day and realized that the crushing loneliness that had defined her life for so long was just a memory. "Good morning, Mama Keisha," called Danny as he entered through the back door, carrying fresh supplies from the market. At 26, he had taken on the role of assistant manager, handling much of the business side of the restaurant while Keisha focused on cooking. More importantly, he had become like a son to her, and she had become a second mother to him. "Morning, honey," she replied, accepting the kiss on the cheek he gave her every day. Martha's already here working on those new biscuit recipes. In the dining room, Martha was indeed experimenting with variations on her grandmother's biscuit recipe, trying to perfect a version that would complement Keisha's chicken. At 73, she had found a new purpose in life, splitting her time between helping at the restaurant and organizing community events that brought the neighborhood together. "Those smell incredible," Keisha said, sampling one of the warm biscuits. "I think we've got a winner." "Good, because we're going to need them for the lunch rush," Martha replied with satisfaction. "Mrs. Henderson called yesterday to reserve a table for 12. She's bringing her church group for their monthly meeting." The change in Mrs. Henderson had been perhaps the most dramatic transformation of all. The woman who had once shoved Keisha to the ground and spewed hateful words had become one of the restaurant's most loyal customers and biggest advocates. She had personally brought dozens of new customers to Mama Keisha's kitchen, using her influence in the community to spread the word about the amazing food and the even more amazing story behind it. "She's trying to make amends," Martha had explained to Keisha early on. "Some people need more time to find their way to kindness, but once they do, they hold on to it fierce." By noon, the restaurant was packed with its usual eclectic mix of customers. Hell's Angels sat at tables next to suburban families. Elderly church groups shared space with young professionals, and children from the neighborhood treated the place like a second home. The diversity that had once seemed impossible on Maple Street was now as natural as breathing. Marcus, now 2.5, moved through the restaurant like a tiny host, charming customers with his bright smile and endless chatter. He had grown up surrounded by love from every direction. His mother, his grandmother Martha, his big brother Danny, and the extended family of Hell's Angels who visited regularly. The shy, often sick little boy had blossomed into a confident, joyful child who believed the whole world was his family. Uncle Mike Marcus squealed when the familiar figure appeared in the doorway. Mike had kept his promise to stay connected, visiting at least twice a month and bringing different members of his extended brotherhood each time. Today, he was accompanied by Tommy and several newer faces, young men who had heard the story and wanted to meet the woman who had changed everything for their brothers. "There's my little man," Mike said, scooping Marcus up for a hug. "Have you been helping your mama in the kitchen?" "I can crack eggs now," Marcus announced proudly. "Mama says I'm a natural chef." "Just like his mama," Mike replied, catching Keisha's eye across the dining room and giving her the warm smile that had become as familiar as family. The afternoon brought its usual steady stream of customers, but also something special. A bus pulled up outside, and 40 children from a Detroit elementary school filed out, part of a field trip that had become a monthly tradition. Keisha had started offering free meals to underprivileged school groups wanting to share not just food, but the message that kindness and community could overcome any obstacle. Miss Keisha called out one of the regular visitors, a 7-year-old named Aisha, whose enthusiasm for the fried chicken was matched only by her love of the stories that came with every meal. "Tell us again about the night when all the motorcycle angels came to help you." Keisha smiled as she settled into the routine that had become as much a part of the restaurant's appeal as the food itself. She told the story of that snowy night of 25 strangers who had needed shelter of the fever that had nearly claimed Danny's life, and of the miraculous chain of events that had brought a community together. "The most important part," she always concluded, "is that kindness is like a seed. You plant it by helping someone, and it grows into something bigger than you ever imagined. Those Hell's Angels planted seeds of kindness everywhere they went, and look what grew from it." As evening approached and the restaurant began to wind down, Keisha found herself in her usual spot by the kitchen window, watching the street where her miracle had begun. The house that had once stood isolated at the end of Maple Street was now the center of a thriving community. Children played in yards where parents called greetings to each other across fence lines. The division and suspicion that had once characterized the neighborhood had been replaced by connection and mutual support. Martha joined her at the window, following her gaze to the street where everything had changed. "You know what I think about sometimes," Martha said quietly. "All the people who are out there right now, feeling lost and alone like you were, feeling scared and abandoned like Danny was, feeling angry and isolated like Mrs. Henderson was. What about them? Keisha asked. I think about how all of them are just one act of kindness away from having their whole world change. One person willing to open their door, one stranger willing to help, one moment of choosing love over fear. Danny appeared beside them, having finished cleaning the kitchen for the day. The best part is that it doesn't have to be a big gesture, he added. It can be as simple as sharing a meal, or offering medicine to a sick child, or just treating someone like they matter. Keisha thought about all the ripples that had spread out from that one snowy night. The Hells Angels who had rediscovered the power of community service. The neighbors who had learned to look beyond appearances and assumptions. The children who visited the restaurant and heard stories about kindness, conquering fear. The countless people who had been touched by the story through news coverage and social media, inspired to perform their own acts of compassion. Sometimes I wonder if this is what my mother meant when she used to say that helping others was really helping yourself, Keisha mused. I thought I was just giving those men shelter from a storm, but they ended up sheltering me from a lifetime of loneliness. Mike had lingered after the other customers left, and he overheard her words as he approached the window where the three of them stood. Your mother was right, he said simply, but she was also wrong about one thing. What's that? Keisha asked. You didn't just help yourself. You helped all of us remember who we wanted to be. Every person whose life you touched that night, every neighbor who learned to see past their prejudices, every child who comes here and learns that differences don't have to divide us. You helped all of them find their way to something better. As the last of the daylight faded and the restaurant settled into quiet, Keisha walked through the dining room one final time, straightening chairs and turning off lights. But her real purpose was simpler: to absorb the gratitude that filled every corner of the space she had built through courage, kindness, and the support of an unlikely family. Marcus had fallen asleep in one of the booths, exhausted by another day of playing host to dozens of surrogate aunts and uncles. Danny gently lifted him and carried him toward the stairs that led to their living quarters above the restaurant. Sweet dreams, little angel, Danny whispered, using the nickname that had stuck since that first day when Tommy had made him the miniature leather vest. Before heading upstairs herself, Keisha stepped outside onto the front porch where it all began. The street was quiet now, lit by warm light spilling from windows where families were settling in for the evening. In the distance, she could hear the faint rumble of motorcycles, probably some of Mike's brotherhood heading home after their visit. She thought about Jerome, her ex-husband who had abandoned her, and Marcus when life got difficult. She wondered if he ever saw the news coverage or social media posts about Mama Keisha's kitchen. She hoped he did not out of spite, but because she wanted him to see what was possible when people chose to stay and fight for each other instead of running away when things got hard. Thank you, she whispered to the night air, addressing her words to her mother, to the universe, to the mysterious forces that had brought 25 strangers to her door at exactly the moment when she needed them most. From somewhere in the darkness, the sound of motorcycles grew louder, then faded as they passed by on their way to whatever adventure awaited them next. But Keisha knew that wherever they went, they carried with them the same message that had transformed Maple Street, that kindness was never wasted, that community was stronger than isolation, and that sometimes the people who looked most different from you were exactly the family you needed. She went inside, locked the door, and climbed the stairs to the home where she and Marcus lived, surrounded by love support and the certainty that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to plant seeds of kindness in the world. In the end, that was the true legacy of Mama Keisha's kitchen, not just the food or the success or even the miraculous reunion it had facilitated, but the reminder it offered to everyone who entered that the smallest acts of compassion could ripple outward in ways that changed everything. The story had started with a woman alone in a storm, but it had become something much larger, a testament to the truth that we are all connected, that kindness is always the right choice, and that when we open our hearts to strangers, we often discover that they were never strangers at all. They were just family we hadn't met yet.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.